In our previous session, we have discussed how to implement transport level security using SSL. In this session, we will try to implement transport security plus message security. So let's try to understand that how we can implement transport security plus message security using WCF. Now what we'll do over here is we will implement message security using username and password. So we will create a custom class for validating our username and password, and for transport security we will be using SSL. So this part is pretty clear, we have already done that, and we need to implement this part. So what we'll do is in this session we will try to implement dual security using transport security plus message security. Transport security we will use SSL, while message security we will use username and password. The first step is that we need to configure our bindings. So basically we need to specify what kind of security mode and what kind of credential type are we going to use for our WCF service. Now in security mode we can configure the binding as transport level, message level, or transport with credentials. Now currently what we are doing, for the current scenario we have to select the third mode, that is we need to select the transport with message credentials. The second step is we need to specify the credential type. What kind of credential type will this WCF service use? So at this moment we have a lot of options here. You can see we can specify none. This is none, not name, none, Windows, username, certificate, and a issued token. So currently we want to enable username and password, so we have to select a third option. So what we'll do is, as a first step, we will configure our binding by providing transport with message credential as a security mode, and the second thing we will provide is a credential type as username. So let me go to my web config file and let me show you how to actually configure the bindings. So here's a simple WCF service sample we have, and this WCF service sample we want to configure using transport with message level. So you can see that this WCF service is pretty simple. It has nothing but it has a get data function, and the get data function is basically, it takes in a numeric number and it basically concatenates and says that you have entered with the number value. Now the first thing what we need to do is, as discussed, is basically we need to go and configure the bindings. So go to the web config file of the WCF service, in the system.service model tag, in the bindings tag, put your binding, that is WS HTTP binding or basic HTTP binding, whatever it is, and then specify a new binding name. So here we have specified the binding name as binding 1, and you can see that over here inside the binding 1, the binding tag, we have specified the security mode to be transport with message, and we have specified that the client credential type we are going to send username. So step number 1, create the WCF service, go to the web config file, go to the binding section, and configure your WS HTTP binding with security mode as transport plus message and message credential as username and password. Now what we have done is that this custom binding which we have created, we have named the binding as binding 1. Now step number 2, now the next step is basically we need to specify this binding 1 to our endpoint. So we can see that in the endpoint we have specified the binding configuration as binding 1. So we have taken the binding 1 from here and we have basically specified the binding configuration as binding 1. Third step, as we have said that we are going to use message security with username and password, and for transport security we are going to use SSL. So we have provided the address with HTTPS. So you can see that we have basically provided the address endpoint with HTTPS. Now the next step is basically to create our custom class. So the custom class which will do authentication of our users. So what I have done is that I have created a simple class here called as myValidator. Now in order to use this class as a message level security, or in order to configure this class on the message level security, we need to ensure that we inherit from the username password validator class. So you can see that I have created a myValidator class which inherits from username password validator class. Now this class basically belongs to the system.identityModel.selectors namespace. So you need to ensure that you have imported this namespace in your project. And then later you need to basically override the validate method. The validate method has two inputs, username and password. Currently what I've done is basically I've just hard coded the username and password. So what I'm saying is basically is that if you provide me shiv123 and pass123, that means everything is fine. But if you provide me anything else, then I will basically throw up a fault exception. So basically the next step is basically we have created a simple class called as CLS myValidator, which inherits from the username password validator class, which belongs to the system.identityMallet.selectors. Now we need to specify this myValidator class in our web config file. So let's go to our web config file. In the web config file, we need to basically specify the class, that is myValidator class, in the username authentication tag. So what we need to do is basically we need to go to the behaviors section, we need to go to the service behaviors section, and we need to add the service credentials tag. And inside the service credentials tag, what we are saying is that please use our own custom authentication mechanism. In other words, use a custom authentication mechanism, which is nothing but the password validation mode, that is the username and password validation type, and use my class myValidator. So in other words, when anybody sends me a username and password, please do authenticate by using this class myValidator. So what have we done? The first step, we have basically ensured that our binding is configured with transport and message, and with the credential type as username and pass username, and our endpoint is configured with HTTPS. The binding configuration is configured with the binding what we have just created, the new type of binding with transport and message. And we have created a custom class called as myValidator, which basically does the authentication, or basically does the checking of the user. And this class we have provided in our service credentials tag. So let's go and compile this project. So let me just build this solution, and let me just publish this WCF service. Now what we'll do is that we'll go and consume this WCF service. So view Solution Explorer. So what I've done is basically I have created a simple web application here, you can see, and in this web application basically I have done the service reference. So basically I have added a service reference here of the WCF service. Now remember one point, that basically this WCF service I have configured on SSL, because we need to implement both the message security as well as the transport security. So you have to ensure that on your INET MGR, through the INET MGR, go to your website and ensure that you have used SSL security. So basically go to your directory security and ensure that you provide the server certificate. So you can see that I have provided a server certificate. Now in case you don't have a server certificate, you can use the makecert.exe. In case you are not aware of makecert.exe, please go to the previous video and you can see over there what basically is makecert.exe. So the next step is basically I have gone here, I have referenced this website with the .svc file, and I have created my proxy object. Now the other things are pretty simple. What you need to do is basically you need to go and create the service client object and pass in your username and password. So you can see that basically I have passed the username and password. So you can see that basically message security is implemented by the username and password, while the transport security is implemented by the SSL on which this your WCF service is hosted currently. Now what we'll do is we'll run this application. First, we'll run this application with invalid password. So let me just pass an invalid password here and let me run this application. Now if you pass an invalid password, basically what will happen is we have thrown an error over here saying invalid credentials. So for the current scenario, I have passed invalid password, and you can see that on my browser he has popped up an invalid credentials message box. Now let's go back again and let's basically give a proper username and password. So let's go to a client and let's give a proper username and password. So now if I run this, so let me just build the solution. Let me run this. It will now allow me to make method calls because I have passed the proper username and password. So you will basically get the concatenation sentence with the number. So you enter 12. So this is how we have implemented dual security in our project. Now remember that you can see there are some other codes over here. For example, the service point manager and ignore certificate. Basically, now this ignore certificate error handler is basically to ignore that this is a dummy certificate. So please do refer the previous video what this ignore certificate error handler means actually. I'm not explaining the same in this video. In this video, I have not explained how to create a SSL certificate and how to install it and how to configure it, because I've already done that in my previous video. So I hope that this session was useful. In the coming up sessions, what we'll do is we'll try to understand how to do WCF instancing and how to do WCF concurrency.